So for industrialization, I did connect it back to the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I said was the thing we're focusing on for this lecture is how to standardize a system. In this case, how do we standardize materials, measurements, things like that? That's kind of the question for industrialization. It goes into that emphasis for a scientific method. How can all the materials be the same? And then when I talked about it in week 10, I told you there's 4 things that are the outcomes. So for this lecture, we're going to be covering 3 and 4. So then I have a couple paintings just to give the kind of general idea of what industrialization is doing. So the countryside is changing. We have new modes of transportation that are making the world a little bit smaller. So now that you have trains, you can be somewhere in a couple hours versus before it would take days or even weeks to travel. So it not only connects people, but it also connects ideas. So ideas are spreading faster, goods are spreading faster. The urbanscape is changing. And then I left us on this image because it's showing this really industrial bridge compared to like the nice stone ones that they would have done in medieval times. So the new archetypes come as a result of new industries. So now that we have a lot of industrialization going on, we have new jobs, and we have to have a place for those jobs to be fulfilled. So the 4 things we're going to talk about in the lecture are starting with transportation. We're going to look at bridges, train sheds, and then all the other stuff. So bridges are the first place we see iron used openly because, again, it's considered ugly and it's considered to only be used for engineering purposes.
Okay.
So they're like, okay, it's appropriate in a bridge, but even then, you can see that they do try to decorate it. So there's 2 types of iron. Just generally, one of them is cast, which you have a mold, you cast in place, and then you remove it. So it's really good with compression, like pressing things against each other, it works. And then you have raw iron, which is made differently. It's stretched into place, so it's really great in tension. So those are going to be seen in these 2 bridge types. So we have our compression bridge, which is just an arch. So as you put weight down on here, these 2 pieces want to buckle, but they're butting into each other, so it's a compression arch. This is Colebrookdale Bridge, and then notice it does have all of these decorative pieces on it, right? So none of these are actually needed, and then even this could have just been like a straight, simple piece. But even here you can see they're trying to dress it up because it's still not considered a very pretty material to look at. We then get the invention of our suspension bridges, which use wrought iron. So you can see they're using tension, not just here, but also right here and then over here, as they're carrying all that weight. And then that leads us into train stations. So at the middle of the 19th century, train stations, typically you had like the regular run-of-the-mill stations, but then you had the really nice ones in the middle of your urban centers. And you started to have people from the upper middle class using them. And for them, the regular old train station wasn't good enough. They couldn't just hop on it. They needed a nice grand platform entrance. So you're gonna see that the train stations have a front, and then they have a really industrial back. They don't care about it as much. So this is what a traditional station looks like, just a small one in the countryside. What you can see is just a long building where you go in, you get your ticket, and then you come out onto the platform and board the train. But even here, you do have your shed be one thing, and then you have your building be a whole separate thing. They don't try to mix it or integrate it in any way because they don't want the iron to play a part in the architecture. So they're trying to say this is engineering and that is architecture. And notice that they do use like classical language there. But our large train stations in the middle of London, they try to build their station as close to the center as possible, but because at the time London was already quite big, they couldn't just bulldoze their way. And they were also competing companies. So the reason we have these 2 next to each other is because this is one company of railroads, this is another one. They both want to get as close as possible, so they just ended up doing this. So if you wanted to ride from one side of Britain to the other side, you have to get off, walk, and then get on another train to go somewhere else. But this image, I think, shows you a good idea of what the front of it looks like. So it looks like a very traditional stone building that looks respectable to go into. And then our train sheds in the back, super industrial. It doesn't have anything to do with the architecture of the front. King's Cross is the same way. So this case, it's not even a building, it's just a stone facade that's blocking us from looking at that utilitarian shed. Have you watched Harry Potter?
A little bit.
Yeah, so that's the train station
Yeah.
in Harry Potter. So this is St. Pancras, the main train station. It's very what we call ecclesiastical, which means that they rob and take from a lot of different styles and time periods. So you can see in this one they're taking the different color, the polychromatic qualities from either Islamic architecture or Italian Romanesque.
Mm.
And then this type of like stepped roof is from Holland. These turrets are from castles. The blind arcading is from the Romanesque. It has a little bit of Gothic. It has a little bit of just kind of everything. So it doesn't really have a definitive style. So it has polylobed ones from the mosques in this case. So they're using a little bit of everything, and that goes to show the 19th century doesn't have a singular style. It just
And when you say what's called,
provides-
it's called polylobe.
Yeah,
Polylobe. Okay.
like earlobes, but
Yeah.
poly, because there's many of
There's
them.
many
Mhm.
Okay.
On the interior, same thing applies. You can see they're beginning to use some iron in this case, but it's very decoratively. And then the way that you would approach it is you would come in a carriage, right?
Mhm.
So if you were someone of the upper class, they would drop you off where this doorway is, and then the carriage would come back down. So it's a big, like, ultra transportation hub.
Mhm.
All of this is a hotel, so if you're gonna take a train at like 6 in the morning, it wasn't really looked well upon if you were traveling at like 4 in the morning in a carriage, so you
Yeah.
would sleep here and then get on your train. It was also really dangerous. And then the back of it is this huge industrial truss piece. And you can see that they just butt it up against the building so as to not mix it with the architecture, so they're drawing a line there. So even though this also does cater to the upper class, they didn't bother cleaning this piece up at all.
Okay.
And then King's Cross, same thing goes. The front of it, this one is probably for like the lower middle class since it doesn't have a hotel, it's just a facade. And then you can see right through it, that's where the sheds begin. And these are a little bit more of a different shape. So notice that they do have a little bit of decoration as they attach to the solid walls of the station so that as you drive past, you have walls that are solid and look nice instead of just a shed.
Mhm.
Right, so they do have like their buildings on the sides in this case to surround that entirety of the station. So as you stand on either side, you can't see the train. So they're really trying hard to hide industrialization because they believe it's really ugly. And if you stand at this level, you can't even see the two sheds that are behind here because it was designed to do that. Now, as a result of having all these trains, transportation, and being able to distribute goods a lot easily, we then have the exhibition hall. So world trades become, or world fairs become a thing at this time, and Britain is the one country that begins this in 1851. So they have the Crystal Palace, and it's a way to show off not just the goods from around the world, but specifically their goods, and kind of try to embarrass the local manufacturers into making something good, because if they're going to be displayed against their competition, they want to have the best one.
Yeah.
So it's a way to kind of drive up the competition and have more honest workmanship. So the Crystal Palace is the very first one. The reason it was created, it wasn't because they wanted an iron and glass building, because obviously that was considered ugly. It was because they wanted to do a masonry building, but they didn't have enough time, and then winter was coming. So when it's winter, you can't work with mortar because it freezes really quickly. So they had those two kind of challenges in the way, but the World Fair was already set to go. So our gardener, Paxton, comes in, and he had already designed this, which is a conservatory or a greenhouse for like another estate. And so he said, I have an idea. What if we make something like this? And they honestly had no choice but to accept it. And then the other kind of challenge of this is the site they had chosen was in the middle of Hyde Park, which is like, for Londoners, it's their central park.
Yeah.
And even at the time, they did have like a lot of environmentalists who were protecting the area. So they didn't like the idea of a permanent building that would destroy all of this, and instead they really liked Paxton's idea because you could easily take it down. So it would easily be constructed and easily be removed once the time came. And so they constructed the Crystal Palace, completely made out of iron and glass. And in the plan, what I was telling everyone was, notice how it's completely dematerialized. There's no wall.
Mhm.
And it's one of the steps towards modernism, having this columned grid where you can do whatever you want inside of it. The walls aren't dictating which way you should arrange things. It's kind of a clean slate where you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So the Crystal Palace becomes a sensation. They do have like different days. If you're upper class, like you can go Monday. If you're middle class, you can go like Wednesday. And then if you're poor, you get to see the tail end of it once everyone else has seen it. But everyone can pay a certain price to get in and see it. It does become like the thing to do on Sundays. And you can see that the construction of it, though it is very industrial, does still have a little bit of decoration here and there to make it look nice, but there's no stone here, right? We have the introduction of a truss. So we've talked about column and beam, and then we've talked about the arch, and then the third kind of spanning method is gonna be our truss.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's gonna be what modernists are gonna use for the most part. And then the way they constructed it was using simple machines. Everything was prefabricated off-site. So because this thing is so large, they couldn't just give the job to like one person to make all the glass.
Right.
They gave it to everyone who made glass in the city. And because of that, you did have to give them standardized measurements. So the Crystal Palace directly led to the standardization of parts.
Okay.
So the glass, the size of the beams, the size of the screws that they're using, the bolts, everything had to be standardized so that you could use it from different people and it would still work. So that's one of kind of the big impacts of the Crystal Palace. And then as it was being constructed, they did create like these little rail systems that worked on the trusses. They would take up the glass with them and just put them one really quickly. So what this also does is it makes the construction, time for construction a lot smaller. It's a lot quicker to put up, and you don't need as much skill to do it, right? Not to say that they don't have skill, but you don't have to go to like years of training how to carve stone. You can just learn how to assemble this in a week, and then you can have a job for the rest of your life. So it becomes a lot easier to get people into the field of construction at this time because they're not fabricating and constructing, they're just putting it together since it's made off-site. This is what it looks like inside, and again, they did keep the trees, they didn't cut anything down, so once this is taken off, it's like it never existed, and that's part of what makes it so incredible to people at the time, because the idea of a movable building is like impossible to them. So under each one of these, notice these say India, milk goods, silks. You do have different countries bring different things and have like their own little pavilions to show off what they can provide. So this is Canada's. And Britain, of course, is showing off all of its industry. So it's heavy machinery, steam engines, that kind of thing. And this is what kind of cements them as what they called the workshop of the world. And everyone wants to emulate them. So the Crystal Palace is copied over and over again every single time that they have a world fair. So France tries to copy it, Germany tries to copy it, have their own Crystal Palace. And then the other impact it has is it teaches people to be consumerism or consumerists. So they have catalogs, and then in the catalog you have everything that is on display, and you can just order it and it ships to your home. So it was this really modern way of shopping that had never been done before, and now people had access to these things that they don't necessarily need, but they want. So this is the first time in history that people are buying things just because they want to have them. And it's people of the middle class now, so not just the upper class doing these things. And because they're all made using industrialized methods, they can create hundreds of these at a time, and they don't have to go commission like a piano maker, make me a piano that's gonna be done in like a year. They can just buy one off a catalog now. So time really changes because of industrialization. All right, so after that, we do have the introduction of a shopping arcade. So this is where you can directly buy it off the shelf. So have you been to like the Bellagio? You know, the stores in the Bellagio?
Yeah, when we were talking about the one at the Forum Shop,
Yeah.
and after that I actually had to go to the Apple store at the Forum Shop, so I got to see what it was about.
So those are shopping arcades, generally high-end, and that's because they were that from the very beginning. So they were inspired by open-air markets where they sold fruits and veggies, and then after that they said, well, what if we make something that's covered in gloss and iron instead of tarps? but we sell luxury goods and we make it for the upper class or upper middle class people. So that's what it started as. Originally it was just for men. Women could shop from their carriage and then have their footmen go out and get it. So the idea of window shopping was actually because women just couldn't get out of their carts. They had to stay in there and be like, I like that. But what it does is it really protects the consumer and then the facade. So as you're inside of this, if it's raining, if it's snowing, if there's a lot of wind, it doesn't matter. You can be a consumer even in the worst weather. And then if you look at the way these windows are made, they project out at the consumer to put the products in their face. So the idea of marketing things becomes huge during this time. And then the biggest gallery, one of the biggest, is in Milan. So if you remember this church from our Gothic lecture, it's right next to it. So it's this whole thing. And the arcade itself is just the inner walls. So this is like apartments and regular housing, but it's the first floor of these that are gonna have our shops. And what that does is it gives people a pastime that it's not just leisurely time, but it's time that you spend buying things. So now people are buying things on their free time. For the architecture, you can now have these really elaborate pieces that are painted that are not going to be washed away by acid rain or deteriorated by the snow or anything like that because they're fully protected. You have daylight, but you don't have the elements. So it's really revolutionary to be outside and not have to be under the rain and still have daylight. And again, notice that this is like Prada, Versace, high-end brands are still what dominates shopping arcades. On the flip side, we do have the department store, and this is meant to be more affordable for everyone, and it's made more for like the real middle class, not upper, but just middle class or lower middle class. And the idea of the department store was to give people a place where they can get a bargain. So if you look at the architecture, it's not really very luxurious. It's not made of stone. They don't spend money on it. So it's kind of like the idea of a Costco where they're saving money on the building and therefore saving you money as a consumer. This is the first place where women are allowed to go by themselves. So it's the entirety of this corner. They do have these windows along the bottom, and a department store, as you know, has all sorts of things. So each window shows you something different. And notice that they're setting them up like they're scenes in the life of someone. And they're showing you how they're using the product. So mannequins become a thing as well. They're not just putting the clothes out there, they're putting it on someone. It does have its skylight, right? So it's atrium in the center. It's completely open, very transparent, like the one we saw today, where you can easily see what everyone is doing on every level, or more specifically, what is being sold on every level. So you want to go up there and you want to get that too. So we have women, we have children, and they can be unchaperoned and unaccompanied. So this is the first place where we have public restrooms for women, where they can go without being labeled like a hoe for being out in the street, right?
Yeah.
So they can go and spend time here, and they're doing it being consumers. So women are being taught to shop and to get things that they don't need but that they want to have for their homes. And then in the world of construction, one of the things that you can order off those catalogs are cast iron facades. So now you can order a whole panel that has your window, a door, and everything you could need. You just have to build the frame for it. So we're switching from a construction that's made inside or outside in with like the stone frame and then you build the walls, to being something that's like more of a shell, a grid and a shell. It's lighter, it's cheaper, you don't have to have an architect design these things for you. You can look at the catalog and go, I want a Corinthian column, I want this type, I want a Gothic looking facade, and you can mix and match these. So the panels would basically be this, and notice they have the window inside of them, they have the column inside of them, they have this inside of them. And the propaganda for it looks like this, right? So it's telling you you just need to have this grid, and then you can just buy the prefabricated panel with windows, decoration, paint, everything is on it. You don't have to have all these steps to create it. Hi. Are you, okay. Do you have a booklet?
Yeah.
Okay. And then this is like the other part of the advertisement. So they're showing you what it looks like in construction and then what it could look like literally 3 days later if you have enough men to work on it. So it's a lot faster. It looks nice, right? You can't really tell that it's made of iron, which is good for them because they think it's ugly. And then for people that are investing in these buildings, they really like it because they can create more of them for a fraction of the price. So this is why urbanization really takes off in places like New York, where you have a whole cast iron district that's still preserved to this day because of this method. It's also used in things like the Eiffel Tower monument. And then if you look back here, that is an exhibition. So the Eiffel Tower was made for another World Fair in like 1880 something, when it was hosted in Paris that year. So they built their Crystal Palace, right? And notice that in this case, they gave it a stone facade. So Parisians were not ready for something as modern as the Crystal Palace. They thought it was still really ugly, which is why they hated the Eiffel Tower. But you could take an elevator all the way to the top. And that was something that had never been done before. They had never seen Paris from that height. Flying machines haven't been invented yet. So for that reason alone, they decided to keep it. But they did think it was ugly at the time. And it was very controversial. But notice that it's still decorated, right? So it's not like it's just the bare bones. It does have some decoration, just picky. And then the last place where we see it introduced into is our public institutions. And so the two libraries that I'm going to show you are by Henry LaBrousse, who was this kind of out-of-the-box thinker, visionary. He was heavily criticized during his time for what he did. But for him, he said, if we have industrialized materials, why not use them if they make everything faster, if they can still look nice? Like, what's the problem with them? So he designs two libraries. This is the first one, Sainte Genevieve. So from the outside, it looks quite normal. All of these panels you see have names on them. I don't know if I have a picture of it, yeah. So these are like famous poets, philosophers, thinkers, and so forth. So this is what we call architecture parlante, or speaking architecture, where it's literally telling you what it is. So in this case, it's telling you I am a library because of all these people on my facade. The plan itself is very long. As most reading rooms are at the time, you want to make them thin so you can have daylight come in from both sides. If you make it too big, you're going to have a really dark central piece.
Yeah.
So this is a pretty standard floor plan, but what changes is, if you notice, the supports in the middle, they are very skinny. So rather than being a thick masonry wall, they're very thin. And that's because he does use an iron structure inside of the stone grid. And it looks like this. So it's still quite decorative. And notice how thin these are compared to the profile that it would have had to been if it was stone. So for the people, it's not just ugly, but it's also shocking to have something that can support that much with such a little cross section.
Yeah.
So for just like perspective, just think about a column that was this thin holding up this roof. It would feel really uncomfortable, like I feel like it's gonna fall. That's how they felt about it at the time. And so to kind of ease their nerves, Henry LaBrousse did give it a thicker base here, but it wasn't necessary. He could have easily taken this iron all the way down. He just did it at this level because it's the level that people are at. So as they're reading, they don't have to think about this like iron structure on top of them because they see stone everywhere at eye level. Here's those skylights coming in. And then part of what's so great about this system is notice how light that roof is. So the loads on these exterior walls are like negligible compared to what would have been a traditional roof type of construction. This is super light. So what that allows you to do is open this up and have this much more daylight in there, versus if you had like a stone roof up there, you would have had to make really heavy supports, and that would eliminate the amount of glass you could have. In the back portion is where they have the stacks. So during this time, and even now, you can see there's not that many books out here, and there was a lot of space to read. So if you needed a very specific book that wasn't already on the floor, you would just tell them what you needed. They would go back into the stacks, get it for you, and then you did have to read it in the library on that day. So if you weren't finished, you just have to come back the next day. You couldn't like loan the book or anything. But in the area where it was just the books and just the staff working, you can see he fully embraces iron. There's no stone here. Everything is made prefabricated to order pieces. So it's showing us that he wants to go this direction, but he can't necessarily go that direction yet because the public is still really iffy about iron. The second library he builds, he gets a little bit more daring. So with this one, originally these were twin courtyards, and then they decided to build a library inside of one. So one of his challenges was, how do we bring daylight into it when we don't necessarily have any exterior facades? So obviously he looks to the sky and he has all this, structure for skylights. And then the way in which he constructs it is he used these domes. So he's getting inspiration from not just classical architecture, but also a little bit from, if you look at it, like Islamic type of architecture, right? Notice the grid, it's very, very thin. So this is what the profile of one of those supports should look like inside of here, but instead it looks like that. So here we're seeing he's progressing, he's getting more bold with what he's doing, and we can tell because not only is this column thinner, but the base of it is still iron. So even though he does thicken it, just for the aesthetics of it all, he doesn't cover or clad it in stone. If it was stone, it'd probably be that big, and it would really eat up the space visually, but instead, because he knows that they're lacking in daylight already, he opens it up, he paints it white, reflective surfaces, the trusses are painted so light goes straight through them. And again, because this is inset into a courtyard, you don't have windows on the side, so instead he paints the nature on the outside. Right, and then that's a summary of that. Did you look at the rating for that week?